You're under arrest for treason. The words cracked through the chandelier-lit ballroom like a rifle shot, stopping the string quartet mid-bow and freezing the silverware above plates of prime rib. Two officers pushed through the sea of gowns and dress uniforms and seized my arms. The metal of their cuffs was colder than the air conditioning. I stood there, in full dress whites medals, catching the light salutes half raised, and then abandoned around me as whispers raced from table to table. In the front row, my father leaned back in his chair, like a man admiring his own handiwork, lips curled in a private smile. "I'm the one who reported you," he announced loud enough to carry. The room exhaled in one wounded sound. Treason. The ugliest word you can hang on an American uniform. Even a decorated one. Even a 4-star. They read the words from a folded sheet, a voice suddenly official and distant, as if reciting a part in a play. Suspicion of unlawful transfer of classified material. Misuse of federal systems. A complaint lodged by a citizen witness. I barely listened. The words were props. The accusation was theater. I felt every eye on my shoulder boards, on the ribbon racks, on a small scar beneath my ear that never disappears under makeup. They stared as if searching for a crack through which the charge might seep and make sense. Cameras rose like a tide. Somebody muttered, "Her father." Another, "My God." A retired chief I knew from 20 years back started to stand. His wife caught his sleeve and shook her head. I kept my chin level, my hands still, my breathing slow. There are worse places to be than under a brutal spotlight. I've been pinned to the earth by the cyclone of a landing rotor, pressed into a wave-slicked deck while the night cut like glass, and I've held a mother's letter in a gloved hand because her son could not. The quartet stopped. The hum of the HVAC felt suddenly loud, a low, steady wind against the flags on the stage. The podium where I was meant to accept an award still shone with its polished brass seal, reflecting a room that was now breaking apart. A server slipped on nothing and caught herself. A politician nearest me shifted his chair, so the seat back formed a shield. No one spoke my name. No one said, "Admiral." The officers turned me toward the side aisle and the wide double doors that had welcomed so many grand entrances. My heels clicked evenly on the marble. I did not offer resistance. I did not offer comfort. I did not look for sympathy. I have learned over years and oceans that silence can carry more authority than any speech ever written. Behind that silence, thoughts arranged themselves with a precision that has saved lives. The complaint had come from him. He said so himself. That fit the pattern, the jabs that began the day I signed my commission. The first Christmas leave, when he stood me at the tree like a misbehaving child and called my uniform a costume. The year I made flag rank, and he sent flowers to my brother instead. Envy shrinks a man. Resentment hollows him out. Tonight he wanted spectacle, and he found it. He wanted me small under his shadow, and he thought he had learned the switch that dims me. He has never understood where my light comes from. "Admiral, ma'am," one officer said quietly, almost apologetically, when we paused near the aisle to let a table of donors push their chairs back and make a path. His partner kept his grip firm, but avoided my eye. They'd been told to do something that didn't fit easily in the body. I don't blame them. Instructions can be a blindfold. I gave a small nod and let them guide me on. A woman near the aisle held a napkin to her mouth, eyes too bright. I recognized her from a Veterans Hospital fundraiser years ago. She had pressed a photograph into my hand of a son who came home different. "Is it true?" she whispered, as if treason were contagious. The napkin trembled. I looked at her and said nothing. Not because I could not speak, but because one word from me would become 1,000 from everyone else. Across the room, my father raised his glass to no one in particular and took a slow drink as if savoring something aged and expensive. He always liked the taste of his own certainty. The double doors were 30 feet away when I felt the faintest tremor underfoot. Not an earthquake, not the clatter of serving trays, a rhythm. Boots somewhere beyond the corridor, not hurried, measured. A sound I know the way a farmer knows rain by smell. The officers escorting me didn't notice. The crowd did not. The chandeliers held their breath. A part of me wanted to smile, and another part, the part that has learned to stay 3 moves ahead, cautioned patience. Let the scene play to the end of this act. The next is written and rehearsed elsewhere. I have tried more times than I can count to explain to myself the precise hour when a father turns from critic to enemy. It doesn't happen all at once. It collects like silt in the bends of a river. He loved to tell the story, at least his version of a teenage daughter who argued too well, who beat the boys at calculus, who outthrew a coach's son by 5 yards. He softened it when he had an audience framing it as pride laced with concern. In private, he made it a grievance. When my first command letter arrived, he folded it once and slid it across the table, as if returning a bill that wasn't his. This, he said, tapping the seal is where you forget your mine. I didn't forget. I learned to be more than what he could carry. We passed the table that had been mine. My untouched place card lay face down by the bread plate. I had picked that seat, because from there between 2 flags, you could see the stage head-on without the glare of the center chandelier. I had planned to stand later and thank the corpsmen, whose names never make the program, the sailors who never stand in front of microphones, but always in front of danger. I had planned to point to the row of gold stars stitched into the hem of memory that no one alive can wear. I had planned to say in words I revised all afternoon that honor is not a medal pinned under a light, but a long, disciplined quiet that survives beyond applause. The paper with those words was still in my clutch until one officer, meaning to be careful, brushed it from my hand. It slid under the table and disappeared among the shoes. When we reached the doors, my father's voice followed like a hook. "Look at her," he said almost tenderly, to whoever would grant him their attention. Even now, she thinks she's above the law. He has always confused stillness with contempt, quiet with superiority. He cannot read blankness as discipline. He cannot fathom that restraint is not fear. I did not turn. I did not give him the theater of my face. Beyond the doors, the rhythm I had felt became more distinct, a cadence carried by the floor itself. The officers tightened their hands on my arms, not because they sensed what I sensed, but because the crowd pressed closer. Cell phones raised. Flash. 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 Time narrowed to a bright corridor. I tell you this not to persuade, but to record humiliation isn't the same as defeat. Humiliation is heat. It can melt you into shapelessness if you let it, or it can temper you. I remembered a desert night when we waited for dawn behind a low wall, sand crawling into every seam of our gear, the world quiet except for the far-off rattle of a generator and a dog that barked once and then thought better of it. I remembered the weight of a satellite phone, a sentence that changed a mission profile, and the exact color the sky turns 2 minutes before first light when the world chooses itself again. Tonight, the sky was plaster and crystal and indoor air, but it would choose again all the same. The law is not a rumor. Neither is truth. The right-hand door swung inward on its brass hinge before we reached it. The officers halted, surprised. The crowd's whisper crashed into silence, as if someone had pulled the plug on a stadium. Boots crossed the threshold in a line steady, commanding the sound of discipline made visible. My father's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. I didn't need to look to recognize the posture, the faces, the resolve. I kept my chin level and my breath even. If you were there, if you stood with your napkin trembling or your phone aloft, you would say the temperature changed. You would say the air became a different thing. You would be right. He had no idea who I really was. I wasn't born into uniforms and medals. I was born in a town that smelled like cut hay in June and hot asphalt in August, where Friday nights meant football, Sunday mornings meant church, and every conversation at the diner circled back to what your father did for a living. Mine ran a small construction outfit and a larger reputation. He shook hands the way some men swing hammers hard fast, showing you the veins and daring you to flinch. The first story anyone told about me was not my first word, or the teeth I lost on the porch step, but the Little League afternoon when I threw a ball farther than the coach's son, and my father laughed a half-second too late. "Atta girl," he said, voice thick a smile, like a shirt ironed wrong. When the coach's wife said, "She's something," he replied, "For a girl. If you were there, you'd have thought it was nothing. A shrug, a joke. That's how it starts, sand grains of dismissal gathering into dunes." School came easy. I liked the way numbers lock into place with a click you can feel in your teeth. I liked history even more, the fixed stars of names and dates, the constellations of cause and consequence, the way our country keeps trying to correct itself in public. I wrote an essay on the Battle of Midway, and another on the Tuskegee Airmen, and my teacher, Mrs. Klein, pressed the corner of the paper to her cheek as if it were warm. "You have a knack," she said. "You have a duty," my father countered at dinner, tapping his fork against his plate. "To practical things. To what pays." When a recruiter visited our high school with a slideshow of the Naval Academy, the stone, the river, the gray-blue mornings, I felt something align inside me, like a compass that had been agitated, settling back to true north. I brought home the brochure. My father read it as if the pages were a trespass warrant. "They'll eat you alive," he said. "You'll cry and crawl home, and I'll have to explain you to the neighbors." My mother, quieter and kinder in all things, said, "She won't cry," and put the brochure under a magnet shaped like a lighthouse, as if to say, "There is a beam for you, look." Fathers are supposed to bless or refuse. Mine bargained. "Go to state," he said, meaning the nearest public university 30 miles down the highway. "Study accounting. You'll thank me." He did not like the academy's application process. He did not like the medical forms, the nomination letters, the way the congressman's aide looked directly at me when asking the questions. "She's 17. He barked as if that number were a defense. "So were you." Once the aide replied, and my father didn't enjoy remembering. He sulked through spring. When the appointment came thick, envelope seal raised enough to feel with your thumb, I took it out to the porch to open alone. The evening smelled like cut grass and the sweet metal odor of the grill. He watched me read the words. He did not ask to hold the paper. He said, "Don't get smart with us when you come back as if intelligence were insolence and leaving an act of war." I did not come back the way he meant. Plebe summer teaches you how to take a command without taking it personally, how to breathe when your chest wants to tumble, how to stitch your own frayed edges before anyone else notices. The first time I returned home in white on white, our pastor shook my hand and gripped my forearm with his other hand like men do when they mean it. The VFW post commander gave me a nod that was worth more than applause. My father introduced me not as my name, but as this one, and added, "She's got ideas." The men laughed, even the kind ones, because laughter is oil on old gears. Later in our kitchen, he pointed to my shoulder boards and said, "Do they make those in men's sizes?" The joke sat between us like a dead thing. I learned to move around it. When you begin to excel, people in a small town keep score. Mrs. Klein sent letters to the editor about our own, and I folded them into my footlocker with the spare socks. I learned charts and currents and the austere mercy of checklists. I learned the distinction between fear and panic the same way you learn the difference between weather and climate by standing in both long enough. Each promotion came with a phone call home. Mine were short. His were shorter. "Don't get a big head," he said when I made lieutenant. "Paper ranks," he muttered when I made commander. When I pinned on Admiral, he didn't pick up. He texted a thumbs up, his first and last emoji. You might ask why I kept trying. Because duty runs forward as well as up. Because there were younger women watching. Because the work mattered to sailors, whose hands remember the weight of lines at 2 a.m., to families waiting 3 deployments deep, to names engraved on brass that never get dust. Because service teaches you a long patience, and long patience lets you outlast 1,000 small doubts. And because even when I stopped expecting my father's blessing, some stubborn part of me believed he might stumble into pride by accident. 1. Thanksgiving. Between deployments, we drove past the river that lifts a thin gray mist at dusk and makes even the mill stacks look beautiful. Inside the house, football babbled from the TV, and my brother-in-law argued with a nephew about carving. My father took the carving knife just to show the room he could, and when I reached for the platter, he said, "Careful, Admiral, wouldn't want to violate a turkey's chain of command." The room laughed. My mother gave me that look she wore too often, apology stitched to love. I kissed her cheek and said nothing, because silence is sometimes a gift to more than one person at once. The first real fracture arrived, not with a slam, but a sigh. A local paper ran a profile on hometown Admiral, half cornball, half careful. The reporter got 2 dates wrong and 1 quote right. The only one that might have saved us if anyone had listened. Leadership means remembering what you serve. My father clipped the article and left it on his workbench with a coffee ring growing from the corner as if to mark it spoiled. When I stopped by that afternoon, he said, "You think you're better than this place?" I said, "No, I think I belong to more than one place." He heard what he wanted. His jaw set. That was the day he began using the word "they" for people in uniform, as if I were not standing in front of him. By then, I had seen enough of the world's sorrow to know that bitterness has a way of recruiting accomplices. A cousin started parroting his lines. A neighbor warned me not to bring politics to the 4th of July parade, by which he meant don't stand too straight in front of the band. The men at the diner kept eating eggs and calling me soldier on purpose. It was almost funny, until it was not. The day my mother found a flyer stuck under the windshield wiper, anonymous misspelled, suggesting I'd gotten special treatment. She folded it neatly, handed it to me, and said, "Your father has friends who think they're helping." Her hands shook. I put the paper in my pocket and told her it would pass. I did not tell her that rumors don't pass. They calcify. So when you ask how a father picks up a phone and gives your name to a stranger who will put it in a system, that will print it on a form, that will be tucked into a folder, that will ride in a cruiser to a ballroom where a quartet will stop playing mid-bow, I answer this. A man does not jump off a cliff in a single day. He steps down a slope and calls it standing still. He tells himself he is protecting something, his pride, his town, his story. He convinces himself you stole those things first. By the time the cliff edge arrives, the ground behind him has already given way. I still carry the town inside me, the diner coffee, the river, miss the porch, with the loose board that catches your heel if you forget yourself. I carry the good voices too, and the old men who taught me to square a corner, and the women who pass casseroles like sacraments. I carry my mother's quiet, and the pastor's grip, and the VFW commander's nod. I carry them into every room where someone mistakes a uniform for armor against hurt. Hurt finds a way. So does honor. You can't always hold both at once, but you can hold steady long enough for one to teach you how to bear the other. That's what I learned before medals, before salutes, before any door burst open to rescue me from a lie. The roots of betrayal are local. The cure is larger. I did not become an admiral by winning arguments at home. I became one by learning to win. Time to let storms spend themselves without letting them rearrange my purpose. The academy made that lesson concrete. Before sunrise, the yard turned into a metronome of feet and breath and orders and steel. I studied until numbers held steady in my head, ran until the horizon quit wobbling, and learned to absorb a correction without losing a millimeter of height. Navigation taught me the math of risk, seamanship, the grammar of cause and effect. You make a plan, then you make a backup plan, and then you learn to trust the person next to you enough to throw both away when the sea says so. Sea duty gave me a second spine. You can memorize weather and still know nothing until a wall of green water rises like a moving building and the deck tilts into angles with no names. I learned how a ship speaks through your boots, how the hum shifts half a note before a bearing overheats, how people will follow you if they see you at 2 a.m. when the coffee is burnt, the logbook is smudged, and the only reward is another hour done right. Old chiefs were my professors. They taught me what matters, and what only looks like it does, how to say again without anger, and how to say enough without apology. I was not promoted because I was a novelty. I was promoted because missions ended the way they were drawn on a whiteboard instead of the way anxiety imagines them at midnight. My first command, I made the mistake new skippers make. I explained too much. A chief, with a voice like a gravel road, cleared his throat and said, "Ma'am, they don't need poetry. They need a picture." He was right. I started sketching boxes and arrows on a pocket card. Before every evolution, something a bosun's mate could glance at and know exactly where to put his hands. We ran drills until muscle memory turned into culture. When it counted, culture is what kept the water out and the panic down. Hard things came anyway. We lost a sailor in heavy seas when a freak line snapped. I wrote the letter to his mother 3 times and mailed the 4th. The first 3 tried to make meaning where there was only absence. The 4th told the truth and promised no more than memory can keep. His division reported for the next watch, and I stood with them, not because it was heroic, but because the deck does not care about your sorrow, and the sea remembers only competence. Selection boards notice results more than speeches. I moved from ship to staff and back again, learning how decisions travel, how they stall, and how they die. The difference between secrecy and privacy, the temperament of budgets, the impatience of calendars. Most of all, I learned to hear the question beneath the question when a young officer knocks and asks for 5 minutes. "Ma'am, what should I do?" Often means, "Will you still believe in me if I choose wrong?" The answer is steady presence. You keep your door open, your back straight, and your promise is short enough to keep. The assignment that put me near special operations looked glamorous from far away. Up close, it was logistics raised to the level of nerve and timing that cannot be taught outside consequence. The first time I briefed a mixed element that included SEALs, I cut the slides in half and doubled the white space. I circled only what instinct could not supply. A senior enlisted man with a calm face and ruined knees told me afterward, "Ma'am, that'll do." In that world, there are few higher compliments. Working with them required a new kind of quiet. The best are not loud about being the best. They are meticulous about water blister tape batteries promises. They keep superstitions and checklists in the same pocket. They hate wasted words and respect necessary ones. Trust arrived the same way it always does there, by being exactly on time, never, almost. By knowing the third option on the map. By admitting what I did not know before anyone else had to pay for it. I earned enough trust that when something far from home needed doing, my phone rang and the question was simple. "Can you hold it together?" The answer was yes, and then it was a plan, and then it was a flight at 0300. News of promotions drifted home like weather reports from another continent. When I pinned on 1 star, the pastor wrote a note on a plain card and slipped it to my mother at church. When I pinned on 2, the VFW commander sent a bouquet that looked like a parade stuffed into a vase. When I pinned on 3, my father stared into his coffee and said that the ceiling. When I pinned on 4, he said nothing at all, which said everything. At the diner, he told anyone who would listen that rank is politics, and politics is for people who can't swing a hammer. I knew better than to argue with a sermon delivered to an audience of eggs and bacon. I kept my own story honest, because life refuses to be anything else. I signed a travel voucher in the wrong box and spent days untangling it because ethics is not a slogan. It is paperwork done right. I chewed out a lieutenant in front of a petty officer and apologized in front of the same petty officer because dignity is not divisible. I missed a funeral when weather closed an airfield and wrote a 5th letter to a mother whose patience outstripped my own. These are not the glamorous pages in a career, they are the true ones. The closer I came to the top, the more I pointed attention away from me and toward the work. Reporters wanted personality. Sailors wanted predictability. I gave the second and tried to be polite to the first. A magazine asked for a photograph of my daily essentials laid out on a table. I sent a list, maps, pens, a small flashlight, a phone I could not photograph, and the words, "Today's plan," on a torn scrap of paper. They did not run it. That was fine. Essential should still mean essential. The job carried me across oceans and into rooms with carpets thick enough to swallow a heel. I briefed men who bragged about shaking my father's hand when they were young, and men young enough to be my sons who kept their hands flat on the table when the conversation turned hard. In every room, I kept 1 chair empty in my mind for the sailors who would live with the consequences of whatever we decided. It kept my sentences shorter. At some point, his disapproval became less a wound and more a weather pattern. You cannot argue the wind into behaving. You dress for it. You route around it. You note the direction and get on with your work. Sometimes he answered my calls. When he did, we spoke of traffic and bills and a neighbor's truck that finally gave up. He never asked about the people whose names I carried like prayer beads. I stopped offering details, not because I was secretive, but because handing him my work felt like laying a clean flag over a muddy table. Promotion to the highest rank felt nothing like victory and everything like assignment. The ceremony was brief. I thought of chiefs and corpsmen and the desert morning that dries your mouth just before first light. Then I went back to work. The next months were a thicket of briefings and budgets and an inquiry into a procurement hiccup that might have become a scandal if we had let it. We did not let it because discipline is a habit long before it is a headline. So when the invitation arrived for the gala back home, I accepted. Not because I needed applause, but because I disliked the idea that pride of place belongs to the loudest voice. I planned to stand, accept the plaque name The Corpsman out loud, and remind the town that service is not a stranger who only appears in a parade. I knew my father would be there with his jaw set, measuring each sentence for arrogance. I did not know he had already found a different audience, one that answers the phone on the first ring and writes things down in ink. The night approached like weather you can watch building while friends insist the picnic will be fine. I pressed my uniform, checked the small silver pin whose post likes to loosen at the worst moment, and tucked my speech into a clutch beside a photograph of a squad I still dream about once a month. I walked under the flags, and chandelier light nodded to men who had once promised me their prayers, and took my seat. I knew who I was. I suspected who he had decided to be. I did not yet know how far he had decided to go. Betrayals don't arrive as thunderclaps. They arrive as errands. A cousin asks for the date of the gala. A neighbor wonders aloud whether the auditorium has side entrances or just the main doors. A man at the hardware store mentions the police scanner app he keeps open on his phone and says, "You hear some things. People mean nothing by it until they do." The week before the gala, my mother left a voicemail that started 3 times and found its way to the end on the 4th attempt. "Your father's been spending time at Mickey's. They talk big there. Don't be late that night." She did not say what I already knew, that he loved the sound of his voice most, when the room tilted toward him. Pride needs witnesses. Revenge craves them. We had months earlier untangled a minor procurement hiccup before it could turn into a headline. It was a nothing that could be made to look like a something by anyone whose blood ran hotter for scandal than for accuracy a part mislabeled on a shipping manifest. A shipping clerk new to the desk. A delay in reconciling a line item because the software update lagged behind the policy memo. We fixed it the way adults fix things, forms resubmitted signatures, collected the lesson written down where the next person could read it. If you wanted to build a fire out of damp kindling, though that hiccup would do, you would need a match and a man happy to strike it. Somewhere in the week before the gala, a call was made to a number whose recordings begin with the words, "This line is monitored." The transcript I would later read showed a man stating his name, then quickly correcting himself to initials, as if outrunning his own impulse. He claimed I'd misused access to classified systems, used a term he'd heard, but could not place in context, and repeated the phrase "stolen documents" twice, the way a performer repeats a punchline that didn't land the first time. He insisted he wanted to remain anonymous for family reasons. He sounded pleased with his mastery of the phrase. He was careful not to breathe too loudly. He did not know or did not care that the agents listening make their living separating heat from light. I did not know about that call until later. What I did know was this: my father had developed a talent for getting things almost right. Almost the right phrase, almost the right posture, almost the right facts. If you don't care about the difference, almost can carry you through a room and out the door with the prize. If you do care, almost is a thud you feel in your teeth. On Tuesday, he told a neighbor that even admirals answer to the law. He wasn't wrong. On Wednesday, he told another that classified just means covered up, and he wasn't right. On Thursday, he was overheard telling the barber that big people only fall properly if you pick the moment, and he believed that was wisdom. On Friday, he bought a new tie. The morning of the gala, a patrol car idled outside Mickey's for 20 minutes, while an officer went in for coffee and small talk. Later, that officer would write in his report that a concerned citizen had visited the station with documentation he believed showed mishandling of federal records and that the citizen had requested discretion until the appropriate time. The documentation turned out to be a printed-out opinion column stapled to a blurry screenshot of a procurement ledger from a blog that mistakes speculation for reporting. I have seen orders scribbled on the back of matchbooks hold more weight. The officer passed the packet up the chain because packets travel upward regardless of their contents. That is the nature of systems. Somewhere above him, someone who disliked embarrassment more than error called a judge. Wording was careful. A warrant issued hedged its bets, bring her in hold. Her briefly asked questions in a room without an audience. The venue was not specified. The timing was left open. The discretion that should have guided everything fell instead to the person who wanted none of it. In the late afternoon, I stood in a hotel room 3 blocks from the ballroom and checked my uniform again, smoothing a wrinkle that no one would see, and straightening a ribbon that would not move. I slid a folded speech into my clutch and tucked the old photograph behind it. My phone buzzed with a message from an old chief. No words, just a picture of a horizon line over dark water, the kind of sky that tells you dawn is on schedule. I breathed. Then I walked. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon and old smoke. Posters on easels pointed the way like polite ushers. Banquet Hall East sponsors, reception veterans exhibit. In the corridor leading to the ballroom, a teenager in a too large jacket collected tickets and looked grateful to be trusted with something. I dropped mine into the box and he grinned at the weight of the paper, as if it proved money was still real. When I stepped through the doors, the room rose, and I nodded the way you nod when applause belongs less to you than to the idea you represent. I took my seat between flags, felt the small hum in the floor that hotels make when the kitchens are busy, and set my clutch beside the bread plate. He looked good. My father has the kind of face that earns him the right tie. He had chosen blue with a diagonal stripe that suggested restraint to anyone who doesn't know how to read knives. He shook hands as if friction were a sport. He made little blades of his compliments. "You've held up well," he told a woman I served with. "For your age?" He took the seat that placed him perfectly within my view line when I would stand at the podium. The committee had not done that on purpose. He would believe they had. He always believed gravity chose him. If you have never watched a person build a stage for his own performance, know this. He will pay attention to the doors. He will calculate the distance from the chair to the aisle. He will check the sightline to the microphone. He will angle his body toward the place the light falls just enough to gild the jaw. He is not vain. He is strategic. During the sponsor's brief remarks, my father kept one hand on the table and the other near his jacket pocket, as if the fabric might whisper to him when the moment arrived. I imagine the phone there was set to vibrate. I imagine the text he waited for read something like, "Now." The arrest came not because the facts required it, but because a public man wanted a public setting. A quieter officer would have found me backstage and asked me to step out for a minute. A braver one would have phoned the agency with actual jurisdiction and asked an impolite question. The ones who walked through the doors that night were neither. They were ordinary men with an extraordinary assignment that did not fit them, and to compensate, they made it larger. The words, "treason arrest," did the work for them. They did not see what I saw, the fragility in their own hands, the tremor of a town using the law as a mirror to show itself righteous. He spoke his line as if it had been written for him. "I'm the one who reported you." He enjoyed the jolt it sent through the room, the way the nearest tables turned toward him, as if he were now the MC. He mistook shock for admiration and fear for respect. I watched him accept the moment like a trophy. He lifted his glass. He waited for eyes to confirm that he had done a brave thing. He did not look at my mother. She had chosen a seat at a different table under the pretense of helping a friend manage place cards. She held her napkin in both hands like a small white flag. Even in that humiliation, I had room for a quiet inventory. I counted exits. I counted breaths. I counted the beats between when a door opens and the brain decides what the new shape in the doorway means. I felt the line between gossip and action snap taut and understood it would not hold long. The officers' grips were firm, not cruel. The crowd's noise rose and then fell, as if the room itself had lungs. A retired chief I knew took a half step and stayed put. A boy with a tray decided he would not cut across the aisle after all. Somewhere far behind the stage, a kitchen clattered on proof that the world continues to make soups and sauces while the rest of us act out our moral theater. When they turned me toward the doors, his voice followed, buoyant and sure. "Look at her," he said to the nearest donor to the heir to the version of himself he most admired. Even now. He loved that phrase, even now, as if time belonged to him. I did not look back. In my chest, the metronome I carry for emergencies began to tick. I could not yet hear boots. But I knew the measure. I knew the downbeat approaching. The lie had made its entrance. Truth was just outside right on time, waiting to be announced. The right-hand door opened first, and then the left, and the foyer light spilled across the threshold in a bright bar that made the ballroom look like a stage. The officers at my elbows stiffened. Not because they recognized the silhouettes, but because their bodies remembered something their heads hadn't caught up to yet. The sound reached us a half-beat later, the measured cadence of trained boots on stone, crisp enough to slice through crystal and chatter and fear. A line formed, not rushed, not theatrical, just inevitable, and the first man through wore nothing flashy at all. Field gray suit, clean haircut eyes like the quiet part of the ocean. He didn't need a badge in his hand. Authority traveled in ahead of him. Behind him came the team sleeves, rolled tight gear, neat, and not a strap out of place. Faces impassive, the way discipline keeps them. The murmur in the room fell through 2 octaves and then stopped altogether. Someone's phone flashed and went dark. The teenager at the ticket box in the hall leaned in to see, and a woman who had planned centerpieces for 6 months put both palms on her tablecloth to steady the little universe she had made. The man in gray stepped to the side, clearing the doorway like a valve, and the commander I knew as well as I know. The scar under my hairline stepped through and found me with his eyes before he found me with his feet. He halted 10 paces from the officers, holding my arms, spine aligned under the flag on the stage. His voice didn't carry because he shouted, it carried because it was true. "Admiral, 4-star, we are here." He came to attention like the word meant what it used to mean when men built ships out of trees, and a dozen chests behind him rose and fell as one. The room did not applaud. The room remembered itself. The officers at my side shifted. Their grips looked at him, looked at me, and looked at each other the way men do when the floor plan of the moment has changed without their consent. The man in gray flicked a glance at their hands on my arms, and it was not a warning so much as a request to speed up the calendar. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "we'll take custody of the narrative from here." He did not reach for paperwork yet. First, he reached for clarity. "There's been a misunderstanding of jurisdiction." The taller officer beside me found his voice. "We have a warrant." The man in gray nodded. "You have a warrant to ask questions. You do not have a case." He held up a leather folder, turned it so the embossed seal caught the chandelier light, and let the room read what needed reading without reading aloud. The effect was chemical. The air changed composition. He addressed me then, and there was no ceremony in it beyond the courtesy due between people who have held the same ground at different moments. "Ma'am," he said, and that was all. I gave a small nod. The commander took half a step forward and lifted his chin at the officers. "You can release the Admiral," he said. Not hard, not soft. It sounded like he was offering them a way to live with tonight when they woke up tomorrow. They let go together, not because they had been ordered, but because they understood what their hands were saying and decided they preferred different words. A man in a suit who had been pretending to be invisible near the stage found the microphone and tried to announce that the program would resume shortly. He got out the first syllable of program, before a look from the man in gray convinced him that language could wait. The commander spoke again lower, now only for the officers and for me. This will be brief. He meant the next part. He did not mean the story that brought us here. The folder opened on the table nearest us, and the first page on top was not an accusation, it was an authorization. You could tell by the signatures straight lines from people whose lives are only ink when history wants to remember them. The language was spare lawful tasking, compartmented oversight, temporary access to systems, governed by letters most people only see in novels. The dates aligned, the codes aligned. The mission set was described in 5 words that said enough to the few and nothing to everyone else. It didn't clear me because clearance wasn't needed. It affirmed that what I had done was what I had been asked to do by the government the warrant claimed I had offended. The irony would have been funny in a different room. The taller officer read fast, then slower, and his ears colored as if the blood that had rushed to triumph was making its way back to humility. We were told, he began. The man in gray didn't let him finish the sentence that would become a bullet point for someone's review board. I know what you were told, he said, still kind, and tapped the signature that mattered most. This is what's true. The shorter officer swallowed. Are we? He didn't know whether to say in trouble, or released, or sorry, so he said nothing at all. The commander spared them both an answer and addressed the room because someone should. There is no treason here, he said, and a human sound moved across the tables like a wind through wheat. My father had not planned for this. He had planned for the cuffs, the gasp, the crooked line of people leaning into him for detail. He had planned for the moment when he could deliver the last sentence of the story he'd rehearsed. Even our kind must answer. He had not planned for men whose answer is a life of showing up, nor for documents that do not bend for private resentments, nor for the way a single saluted word can redraw the map of a night. He kept his glass in his hand because he didn't know what else to do with it. The ice had melted to a single clouded cube. He looked older by the time it cracked and turned the drink wet. He still had his jaw, but his jaw no longer had him. The man in gray closed the folder, not with flourish, with finality. If anyone requires a formal statement, we'll provide it outside after the Admiral gets some air. He turned to the officers. You'll walk with us. You'll want to hear what you weren't told. They nodded, relieved to have a next step that looked like work instead of theater. The commander looked to me, not for permission, but for timing. I let one more beat pass the beat that lets a crowd settle into the truth it has just learned, and then I took one step forward, not toward the door, but toward the podium. No one stopped me. I didn't touch the microphone. I didn't need amplification for 10 words. Ladies and gentlemen, I said we'll honor the fallen first. I meant it. The agenda for the evening had always begun with the names we carry, the ones no mission brings back. I put my hand on the polished wood and bowed my head, not for show. 100 chairs rustled, and the 100 bodies in them remembered they knew how to be solemn for the right reasons. The man in gray stood at ease. The commander closed his eyes. In the silence, the teenager in the corridor straightened his jacket. When I lifted my head, I met my father's eyes across the distance. He tried to hold the old look, the one that says he still frames the world, but it faltered. For a second, naked as an unpainted wall, he looked like a man who had misread a label and served the wrong thing to people he wanted to impress. He opened his mouth, then closed it, and put his glass down with both hands, as if it had become heavy. My mother at her far table breathed out and pressed her napkin flat with her palms, the way you smooth a bedsheet after a night of fever. We walked out together, not in a parade, not in retreat. The man in gray set the pace. The officers to either side of him, the team a quiet geometry around us that felt less like protection than like respect. In the corridor, the teenager whispered, "Ma'am," and I said, "Thank you," because courtesy restores what spectacle breaks. Outside, the air had that hotel smell of mulch and chlorine and exhaust, and beyond it, the real air waited, the kind that carries night sounds, in a train 2 miles away, in a dog that barks once and then decides to save its comment for morning. On the curb, a black SUV idled and someone opened the door without making it a gesture. Before I got in, the commander. touched 2 fingers to his temple in the smallest of salutes, the kind you give when you've earned the right to eliminate flourish. "Ma'am, with your permission?" He said, "We'll brief them properly." I said, "Do." And the man in gray added, "We'll also address the source of the complaint." He didn't say my father. He didn't have to. Process would. It always does, late and slow and sure. Back inside, the program would rearrange itself. A quartet would find its way back to the right measure. A committee chair would explain what could be explained. People would invent a new story they could tell themselves about what they had witnessed, one that made them brave, parceled out, and fear communal. That's human. Out here under a sky that had finally darkened enough to be honest, I took one breath of air that had nothing in it but oxygen and the faint sweetness of a municipal flower bed and let my shoulders settle. The truth had walked into a room and stood up straight. The lie had nowhere to sit. They briefed the officers in a glassed-in conference room off the lobby while I waited in the hotel's side garden, the kind of rectangle of shrubs and brick that exists mostly to give smokers a place to stand. A small fountain made the sound of coins falling into a jar. Over the hedge, the band restarted in cautious phrases as if music were a nervous animal coaxed back out of a carrier. I stood with my back to the ivy and listened to the night. It has a way of separating the noise people make from the truths they don't say. I could have left, then slipped into the SUV, gone where the briefing would be clean and the paperwork cleaner. Instead, I waited. It is not strategy to flee the conversation that makes all the others finally make sense. He came out alone, not because he wanted privacy, but because he could not bear witnesses at the moment when the narrative turned and did not carry him with it. He stopped 3 paces away, still in the doorway light, which lent him a color it does not give to any honest sky. For a second, we did not speak. We had rehearsed silence for years. We were fluent in it. He adjusted his tie the way men adjust an oath they no longer intend to keep. "You humiliated me," he said at last, choosing the only angle that could render him the injured party. I let the words pass like weather. "You humiliated yourself," I replied. The fountain counted quarters into the jar. Behind him, a bus sighed at the curb and moved on. "They told me you were dirty," he said, and I heard the coward's comfort in the passive voice. "Who?" I asked. He gave me a list of pronouns. People folks, a guy who knows a veteran at the bar, who hears things. He put the last one down like a trump card. A veteran, he repeated as if the word itself could absolve him of not knowing what he was talking about. "You didn't ask me," I said. He lifted his chin. "You'd have lied." He shot back fast with that old quickness he prized in himself. "I've never lied to you," I said, and I meant the kind of lie that plasters over rot. I have spared him details. I have never sold him fiction. "You keep secrets," he said, as if the distinction were invisible. "I keep faith," I answered. "With the mission, with the people under my command, with the country you taught me to pledge before you taught me to drive." He flinched in the smallest way, the way a body flinches when a muscle remembers work it hasn't done in years. He looked at the shrubs, at the brick, anywhere but at me. "You make me small," he said, and there it was, the part he never said in the clear. "No," I said, "I make you visible. To yourself." He swallowed. "A father is supposed to lead," he said as if quoting a calendar. "Then lead," I said. "Lead yourself to the truth. It's not far from here." He searched my face for mockery and did not find any. "I am not cruel. I do not take trophies, not even in private." He set his hands on his hips, elbows wide, the posture of a man trying to rediscover his outline. "You talk like a sermon," he said, meaning to belittle and landing instead on memory. "A sermon saved you," I said softly, because whether or not he had heard it, the words in that folder were a kind of secular absolution. "They didn't come for me because I am special," I added. "They came because the truth is stubborn. That's it. That's all." He frowned at the word stubborn. He thinks it belongs to him. "You made me the villain," he muttered. "You volunteered," I said. They asked for a statement, he snapped. You offered a performance. He looked up sharply, stung. I wanted you to learn, he said, and I almost laughed, not unkindly. To learn what I asked. He groped for it, then assembled a pile of half-bricks: humility, consequences, respect. Respect for who I asked, gently. For you. He stood there in the doorway, light, and could not say no and could not say yes, and chose instead the refuge of anger. You're not better than me, he said. No, I said. I am better than the man you pretended to be tonight. For a long beat he breathed, and the air went in rough. All my life, he said, I built a name. You took it and made it yours. No, I said again, and it was astonishing how many wrong doors one small word could close. I took my life and made it honorable. The name is still yours. It will be tomorrow when I'm gone. What do you want it to mean? He looked at his shoes then, and the posture of a boy arrived like a shadow that had been standing off stage, waiting for its cue. I didn't know about all that, he said, gesturing toward the hotel, the folder with its signatures. That's right, I said. You didn't know. You preferred not knowing. You can fix that. Start there. He lifted his eyes. There was water in them, less a tear than an admission that tears exist. What do you want from me? He asked, and it was the first honest question he had asked me in a decade. Accountability, I said. He flinched again at the bureaucratic ugliness of the word. Say what you did, I continued. To the people you told, to the men who walked through those doors with guns because you wanted an audience. To Mom? At the last word he blinked, not because he had forgotten her, but because he had miscalculated how much she had already carried tonight. She knew he asked, and the child in his voice was almost unbearable. She knew you, I said. She knows that you'll choose a stage over a table if someone hands you a microphone. He took a half step, then stopped. And you? He asked. What do you want from me? I thought about saying nothing, about letting the question hang like a sign at a crossroads. He would choose whichever road, let him pretend he'd taken the harder one. But I am not a ghost in this family. I am a daughter who happens to carry a different kit. I want a father, I said. The kind who stands in the back of a room and nods. The kind who tells the barber the truth, even when there's no one to clap for him. He folded then, not in defeat, but in a kind of structural adjustment. His shoulders lowered. The bones of his face moved toward their original positions. I don't know if I can do that, he said in a voice I recognized from a long time ago. Try, I said. That's heavy enough for today. The door opened behind him, and my mother stood there, hair slightly awry, napkin still in one hand as if habit had forgotten to return it to the table. She looked at him, then at me. It's cold, she said, meaning everything. Come inside. He glanced at her, at me, at the blank space between us, where so many unsaid things had kept their vigil. I'll talk to them, he said. And I knew he meant the donors, the barbershop. Mickey's the men who build themselves from other men's stories. Good, I said. Use short sentences. Use your own words. We walked in together, not arm in arm, not apart, a geometry that would do for now. In the lobby, the man in gray waited with the officers who looked relieved to be back in a world of procedure instead of spectacle. We'll need statements tomorrow, he said to both of us. My father nodded. You'll have mine. His voice had the plainness, dignity, lends to a sentence when pride quits renting it a costume. The commander gave me a small look that asked and answered at once. We're square tonight, I said. He said yes, ma'am, and disappeared into the elevator, leaving behind the faint smell of a hallway, cleaned recently enough to be respectable. At the ballroom door, my father stopped. The quartet had found its courage. The committee chair held the program like a man reconciling hope and notes. You don't have to go back in, I told him. I do, he said, and for once, I believed he guessed correctly. He stepped through before me and walked to his table and stayed standing. The nearest faces braced for another performance, and instead he gave them a sentence with no clever in it at all. I was wrong, he said. It traveled further than any toast. A small sound moved through the room, the one humans make when they recognize they are still capable of recognizing something. He looked at me, and I nodded. It was not forgiveness. It was the bridge forgiveness will use when it is ready to cross. Later, when the night had thinned and the committee ran out of starch and the last photo had found its flash, I stood on the loading dock where the cool air makes every breath feel earned. The sky over the river had the color of tin. Somewhere a train sent one long note across the dark like a promise held at arm's length. I thought of the girls who would see tonight retold poorly in the morning and try anyway. I thought of a town that might learn to tell a better story about itself. I thought of my father inside that room, seated now, his napkin in his lap, like a truce he might keep. I let the air go out slow and felt my shoulders unlock. Reckoning is not the end of a thing. It is the first honest page. Memorial Day came on a Monday that smelled like cut grass and charcoal, the kind of morning when flags look heavier than usual because they are bearing names. The town had painted the curbs 2 days earlier. The lines were still crisp. At the edge of the square, veterans in mismatched caps adjusted their jackets. A Boy Scout troop practiced standing still. The pastor held his binder the way you hold a bird that trusts you. I arrived without an entourage and took a place near the back under a tree that had outlived 3 police chiefs and a mayor. I don't like stages for grief. The ground does the job better. He was there already early in a way he never used to be. My father had on a suit that had seen more weddings than funerals and a tie the color of church carpet. He noticed me the way a man notices weather, with respect and without surprise. He didn't wave. He did something smaller and more difficult. He held my gaze and nodded once, not to claim me, but to acknowledge me. My mother stood between us, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like she didn't have to hold us up to keep us from falling into each other's shadows. The service began without flourish. A high school senior with a trumpet stepped forward and made the instrument sound older than he was. A woman from the Gold Star families read 7 names and stopped twice to steady her voice, and the stopping said more than perfect fluency would have. The VFW commander I respected spoke like a man watering a garden, slow, careful, attending to what matters. He called the town to remember that we are more than the sum of our commerce, that our reputation is not just a rhythm of gossip, but a ledger written in service and sacrifice. People shifted on folding chairs. Silence took a seat with us. When the moment came for the wreath, the committee chair cleared his throat and looked down at his program as if consulting a map. "We invite Admiral." He began cautious, and then said my name the way it is meant to be said in public, plainly without apology or italics. I walked forward only as far as the first row and stopped. "Today, the wreath belongs to the families," I said. The woman who had read the names stood and took the ribbon with both hands. No camera tried to make it about anything else. The town let the moment belong to who it should. It would have been enough, but life had a second measure written for the day. The VFW commander raised his chin toward the crowd. "Before we close," he said, "a citizen has asked to speak briefly. People don't usually ask to speak at memorials unless they want to pick a fight with the calendar." But my father stepped forward, and the crowd understood in an instant that the fight was with himself. He didn't take the mic from the commander. He let him hold it the way a sponsor holds a rope. "My name is..." He began, and then said his name like it weighed what it should. "I made a mistake," he said next, and the second sentence came out cleaner than the first. "I mistook attention for truth. I told a story I wanted to be true because it made me feel like a man who sees through things. I hurt my daughter. I disrespected the people who serve. I did it in public, so I will say this in public. I was wrong. No theatrics. No embroidered wisdom. Just the simple carpentry of a sentence built square. The sound that moved over the chairs wasn't applause. It was a collective exhale that said the town still knew how to breathe together." He turned toward me without turning the moment into a performance. "I'm going to spend time learning what I didn't bother to know," he said. "If you see me at Mickey's and I talk nonsense, tell me to hush. If you hear me at the barbershop and I start with, 'I heard,' tell me to start with, 'I was told wrong.' I'll practice. The commander closed the mic. The pastor put a hand on my father's shoulder, as if to say that repentance can also be ordinary, and that's when it lasts. After the service, people did what people do. They formed a line without admitting it's a line. Some wanted to shake my hand, and some wanted to touch my father's elbow, and some wanted simply to stand nearby until their breathing matched the town's again. A boy in a scout uniform looked up at me and asked, "Is it hard to stand still when they say things that aren't true?" I told him the truth. Yes, and it's harder to move well if you haven't practiced standing still. He nodded, as if he could feel the lesson fit in his pocket, next to a folded merit badge card. My mother invited us to the house for lunch. The table held potato salad and ham, and a lemon cake with a single sag in the middle that made it more trustworthy. We ate without ceremony. Halfway through a second cup of coffee, my father reached into a drawer and produced a small box I hadn't seen in years. Inside lay the crooked, scuffed class ring he used to wear when he needed to feel like someone who once finished something. He set it on the table between us. "I was proud of this," he said, "and I let it do too much work for me." He slid it toward me, then stopped and laughed at himself. "Old habit," he said, and slid it back. "No," I said. "Keep it. Let it do the right work now." We didn't fix everything that afternoon. That's not how moral math works. You don't balance the ledger in a single column. You start writing in the right book. He asked questions, the kind that fit into sentences ordinary people can live with. How does a mission become yours? Who signs? Who watches? How do you keep faith with people who can't know the details? I answered with the same kind of sentences. I told him how silence is not a lie when it protects the living. I told him how humility travels better than certainty. I told him how service isn't a costume. It's a promise you renew every time you're tempted to be the main character. When I left, the afternoon had turned the river to tin again. A breeze off the water lifted the corner of the porch flag, and the sound was less a flap than a whisper. He walked me to the steps and stopped on the second one, exactly where he used to stand when I went off to school. "I'll be at the next ceremony," he said, "in the back where good fathers stand." "Good," I said. "Bring your own folding chair." He smiled, and it didn't try to sell anything. On the drive back, I thought about the people who will never get this kind of ending, the daughters whose fathers never learn the difference between being right and becoming good, the mothers who hold napkins forever. I thought about the men in gray suits whose work is to pull truth through systems, like thread through cloth, until the pattern appears. The commanders who speak just enough, the teenagers who straighten their jackets when the moment asks for their small bravery. I thought about the girls who will watch a clip of this day, stripped of its context, and find inside even a clumsy edit, a reason to keep their backs straight. You do not get to choose your whole audience. You do get to choose your voice. If you've carried a betrayal through your life, the way a soldier carries weight, a quiet, grinding burden, you are not alone. If you've been the person who told a loud story because the quiet one asked you to change, you can still put the mic down. Start small. Make one correction where you once made a claim. Stand in the back. Nod when someone else speaks the truth you were not ready to carry. And if this story gave you a measure of steadiness, share it with someone who could use a steadier afternoon. Stories travel further when they lay down burdens instead of collecting them. Thank you for listening, for remembering, for standing with those who serve and those who wait. The gavel never falls. It hovers in the judge's hand like a hawk deciding to dive, and the room holds its breath. The Admiral in dress blues turns voice carrying without volume, call sign. Iron Widow. Benches scrape, people stand, the flag stirs. My father's eyes meet mine and lose their footing. Pride the armor he has worn longer than his wedding ring buckles with a sound only I can hear. He came expecting disgrace. Word had lapped the town like a rumor, with good shoes, a hearing, a review, a reckoning. The courthouse wood shone like Sunday pews. I enter after the Admiral because that is the order today, not flourish protocol. The judge who once taught me to parallel park in an empty church lot freezes mid-breath. He has seen my name on paper. He has not seen the weight of it on boots. On the aisle, my father stands at attention nobody asked for. He isn't in uniform. He doesn't need one. Some men wear posture like rank. He taught me that before he taught me the alphabet of tools. Today, he leans on it like a wall while the ground changes. Case numbers rattle like spent brass. The Admiral's ribbons make a quiet biography. He steps forward as if the deck might roll. Your Honor. He says the officer presents served with distinction in operations that will never have parades. The men who came home know why. No music swells. Silence is the better anthem when truth needs room. The judge recovers and asks the formal thing. Name for the record. Iron Widow the Admiral answers, letting the call sign arrive first as it did in life. Then my given name. Then my rank. In our world, the story that saves you often begins with what others called you when there wasn't time to argue. The room tilts on two hinges. First hinge, my father. He hears the call sign, like a foreign phrase he should recognize, and can't. He studies the Admiral, then the flag, as if cloth could translate. He does not look at me, not yet. You don't look at an eclipse until your eyes are ready. Second hinge, the town. Neighbors who saw me at the grocery with river-wet hair guessed Marina maybe. They prayed for sons in far places and didn't imagine their prayers crossing my path. Assumptions creak when renovation starts. The bailiff takes a step that means nothing and everything. He's making space for respect to find its footing. It moves down the aisle like weather. The young man, 4 rows back, fresh, high, and tight, stands without looking around. Standing is contagious when honor enters by an unexpected door. The judge doesn't tell them to sit. I am not here for spectacle. I am here because a record needs cleaning and a rumor needs a witness. The Admiral insisted on the microphone. He lays out not what we did, but what mattered, the planning that saved seconds, the seconds that saved lives. He doesn't look at me when he says my call sign again. The lesson is for the room, most of all for my father. He finally turns. His eyes inventory first uniform boots braid. Then the thing he can't inventory, presence. We learned presence differently. He quieted rooms with volume. I learned to steady them with radios, logistics, the hum behind a plan. Both kinds alter a room. Only one demands applause. This isn't that. At a kitchen that smelled like shoe polish and fried eggs, he once told me standing straight would keep me from bending to other people's weather. I stand now. The old advice works. The old assumptions do not. His pride meets air it wasn't built to breathe. It fogs, then fractures. The judge asks if I will speak. The Admiral's chin gives a small no. Sometimes the strongest sentence is the one you refuse. The record will show he spoke for me. The room will remember I didn't need him to. Near the door, a boy whispers, "That's her." The whisper travels. An old man in a VFW jacket sets his palm over his heart because muscle remembers. A woman who taught my 7th grade civics nods once, like she's grading an answer she didn't expect to like, and does. My father reaches for humor, the last tool men use when the others fail. Well, he offers, I'm sure she's very good at paperwork. The room doesn't laugh. Respect is not nervous today. The Admiral shifts. Your Honor, we respectfully request closure on the allegation under Docket 31. The officer's actions met and exceeded standard under conditions that could not be modeled. Lives were preserved. Let the record say so plainly. It isn't poetry. In rooms like this, precision is mercy. The judge glances at the gallery, at a town learning a new shape of itself, then back. Granted, he says. A small door unlocks. Somewhere a breath releases. Somewhere a hand unclenches. We do not cheer. We do not clap. The standing is enough. Standing is the sound a community makes when it edits itself toward courage. My father stays seated, not protest, not refusal, just a man discovering the map he carried is missing roads. The Admiral turns to me last. The salute he gives is almost private. I return it with the economy we both prefer. Then he faces the door and waits. Leaders leave that way by teaching where to look when they are gone. I take one step, then another. At the threshold, the boy meets my eyes. His shoulders try a square they may grow into. I nod, and he turns that nod into ballast. Behind me, my father says my given name quietly enough that only memory turns. He doesn't add rank. He doesn't add daughter. There are words too heavy for today. For him, choosing none is progress. If you want to know how this room came to be, why the judge's hand stalled, why the Admiral said the call sign first, and why a proud man's pride became too heavy, you have to start before law and after love. At a kitchen sink where a straight back meant virtue and silence was a dialect, where I learned to stand and he learned not to see it. He believed virtue began in the spine. Before I learned long division, I learned to line my heels on the kitchen linoleum so my back met the air like a wall. He'd tap my shoulders, not hard, not soft, until they settled where he approved. A straight back tells the world you won't break, he said, slinging truth like a carpenter's belt. The house smelled of shoe polish and black coffee, of floor wax, and rain-damp jackets hung by the door. In winter, the heat clicked on like a command. In summer, the box fan chopped the afternoon into squares. My mother kept books stacked on the dryer because there wasn't room anywhere else for quiet. We were a Midwest family, stitched out of pay stubs and chores. Dad wore his hair like a regulation even after retirement. The neighbors called him Sarge, half affection, half permission, to let him run the barbecue like a field exercise. He measured a day by what got done, and a person by how they carried it. I loved him for the steadiness, and learned to fear the edge that steadiness could hide. My mother moved inside his weather, like a woman who'd studied the almanac. She folded mercy into small tasks, peeling an apple in one perfect ribbon, fixing a hem while the news hummed, tucking a poem into my lunch beside a peanut butter sandwich. It was never rebellion. It was ballast. Sunday meant church, not for the sermon. Dad distrusted speeches, but for order bulletins, stacked straight pews, filled from front to back, hats off when the organ began. Afterward, we'd drive by the river, and he'd talk about real work, the kind you could point to poured concrete miles of fence, a roof that kept snow where it belonged. I pointed to at the courthouse, the gym, the library, as if buildings could bless me back. When I was 8, he taught me to check the oil and read a tape measure. When I was 10, he taught me the names of his medals and not to touch the glass. When I was 12, he timed my mile and said it was decent for a girl and a disappointment for a runner. He believed in honest grades. He issued them without ceremony. If I brought home an A, he looked for the smudge on the page. If I brought home a B, he turned the page for the next assignment. Our town had 2 seasons, football and after. Under Friday lights, boys ran like future men and girls cheered like tradition. I ran in the mornings instead, when the air was clean and the stoplights still yawned amber. Some mornings Dad joined me, and those were good miles. His breath steady beside mine, shoes in cadence, no talk, because talk would have made the road smaller. Then we'd return, and the kitchen would remember who we were supposed to be. His stories of service came out sideways, mostly in the way he folded towels with corners that met like orders, in the way he repaired anything that bent, in the way he watched the evening news and saluted no one. He'd say men and mean a posture more than a person. He wanted a son to carry it. He got me. He didn't say the disappointment. He let the world say it for him and nodded like a foreman counting bricks. Mom did her persuading in the margins. She drove me to the library when the weather said stay home. She circled dates in the newspaper for free museum days, 2 towns over. She told me the alphabet of birds and the grammar of patience. When Dad said don't blink, she said look twice. At night, she graded papers in pencil, gentle corrections, a soft graphite hush, and left a clean eraser curl on my desk, as if to say, mistakes are not a verdict. The first time I said Navy out loud, the word felt like a stone that had been in my pocket for months, warmed by my hand, shaped by silent arguments with the mirror. I'd sat up late reading histories of ships and charts of storms that met their match of women whose names lived in footnotes anyway. I liked the logic of navigation and the unflinching math of tide tables. I liked that skill, not chatter, kept men alive. When I told him, he went still the way he did when a tool broke that shouldn't have. He didn't shout. He adjusted. You want attention? He said, eyes on the mail. That's not service. The letter opener made a neat slice, like a line drawn between us. We didn't slam doors. We curated silence. Dinners went on schedule. The dishes stacked at the left of the sink. He inspected chores as if he were making sure the house would pass muster. I passed muster and failed a different test I couldn't locate. On Saturday mornings, he'd run a finger across a sill and raise an eyebrow at the dust that had learned to hide. I learned to see what he saw and more. I learned that respect built from fear can hold a porch and ruin a room. I found allies in unlikely places. A physics teacher who put a soldering iron in my hand. A track coach who cared more about how I finished than how I started. A librarian who set aside accidentally ordered naval histories as if the system itself wanted me briefed. Mom parked 2 blocks from the recruiter's office so no one would report her to the town gossip chain. In the front seat, she graded vocabulary quizzes while I signed forms. She didn't ask what he'd say. She asked if I understood the weather I was walking into and if my shoes would hold. He kept the medals dustless and the arguments dusty. I wrote my application essay at the kitchen table while the refrigerator performed its long, low hum, and the clock clicked off a life. I wrote about cadence, not glory, about maps, not banners, about wanting the kind of responsibility that doesn't get photographed. When the thin envelope arrived first, I didn't show anyone. When the thick one came in March, I stood in the doorway of his study and knocked. He opened it like an invoice and read just the line that said, "We are pleased." He folded it back along the crease it came with and placed it on the desk. "So, you're serious," he said, weighing the word and finding it too light. We never discussed it again, which is different from deciding. He didn't come to the backyard graduation party. He drove by once slow, like a patrol. I watched the taillights disappear around the corner and felt my spine correct itself without his hand. The morning I left for plebe summer, Mom tucked 3 envelopes into my duffel. Open when lonely, open when hurt, open when you forget who you are. At the bus station, she told me to stand up straight and we laughed at the shared joke. He had an appointment to get the tires rotated. I boarded. Annapolis did not love anyone back. That was the point. It sanded us down to what would hold under weather we hadn't met yet. My back learned new truths. The clock learned new names for the same hours. I learned that standing straight in the right room could put air in other people's lungs. I sent postcards home with lines that made sense in our house. Good time on the mile. Inspections clean. Learned something that will last. His replies never came. Mom's did. She sent me poems broken into tactical lines. On Sundays, when the chapel smelled like polish and old wood and the river wore light like a ribbon, I sat in the back and listened to the creak of benches under the weight of men learning to carry more than themselves. The organ spoke a language my father might have respected if it wore boots. I learned to pray without asking for exemptions. I asked for clarity for enough for the right kind of fear. When I came home on a brief break, he had rearranged the medals in the case left to right, higher to lower, as if order could make a story true. "You're thinner," he said. "You're still too proud." I made coffee the way he liked it, and did not report what pride had cost that week, the blisters, the size of coins, the grades that felt like verdicts, the instructor who said, "Do it again," with a flatness that erased every reason to quit. We moved around each other like men on a deck in high wind, hands out for balance, eyes on the horizon, pretending it was practice. It would be years before a call sign followed me into rooms he respected and made them respect me back. Before that, there was only the kitchen and the spine and the silence and a mother who kept smuggling in softness like contraband. You build a life with what's on the workbench. He handed me discipline. She handed me mercy. I learned to hold both without dropping either. The shape of the future was in that grip, even if neither of us could read it yet. Coronado begins with the taste of salt and a wind that doesn't negotiate. Sand gets into doctrine. It finds the seam between sock and skin and writes its own training plan. I wasn't there to become a SEAL. Doors were shut in ways that signatures couldn't open, but teams don't run on a single kind of muscle. They run on plans that hold when weather forgets its manners. They run on radios that don't lie and logistics that arrive when faith is tired. I learned to carry that kind of weight. The first morning on the grinder, men shouldered logs that looked like the roof beams of a hard season. I watched angles breath the way a formation sways when one thought travels through 6 bodies. A chief with a face that had been carved, not grown, handed me a clipboard without ceremony. "You're the ops intel officer," he said, like he was telling me the weather. "That means no surprises unless you plan them." He walked away before I could nod. Men like that don't waste a cent. Operations is a church for people who worship cause and effect. Maps unrolled across tailgates, grease pencils tracing arteries a city forgot it had. Radios murmured like prayer. I learned the names of streets where we would never put boots and the sound a pump makes 10 seconds before it dies. I learned to count time in heartbeats and battery bars. I learned that the plan you keep in your pocket is less important than the one you can say in a sentence without looking down. Respect arrives in inches. The first inch came after a swim in water colder than memory. I wasn't on the roster. I was there because respect likes to see if you'll shiver and stay anyway. I stayed. After the chief with the carved face stopped tapping his pen through briefs. Silence is a promotion if you've earned it. The second inch was an update no one asked for, weather models stitched to a fuel table, an alternate route named for a church because it passed 3. The table grew quiet in a way that meant people were recalculating. Why church? A sergeant asked, testing for fable. Because people linger near grace, I said. Traffic slows. He snorted like he didn't want to like the answer and did. We went forward to places that should only be visited by maps. Diesel and dust alleys that bent wrong roosters in the wrong hemisphere. We worked out of rooms whose lights begged for retirement. Radios coughed. Men strapped on gear with hands that had learned the width of survival. My job was the hinge between what we knew and what we could survive not knowing. The plan that made the call sign wasn't grand, just exact. A bomb maker moved like a shadow, faithful to small habits. We mapped his devotions, a shop where tea tasted like sugar, had given up a cousin whose gate stuck a pattern of leaving that fit around the afternoon heat. We set a net you couldn't see because it was made of seconds. We killed cell towers where his thumb would go first. We placed a truck 2 blocks back where men could lean without looking like men leaning. We drew 3 routes: choir, chapel, church. Choir was fast and narrow. Chapel was honest and exposed. Church was longer, but blessed by small delays. Vendors counting change like it mattered, kids running like they had something better to do than get out of the way. When the first vehicle stalled 10 car lengths earlier than rehearsal, I felt the air change. You can hear it if you've learned the hum. I moved us from choir to church with a sentence, and my voice stayed level because their pulse would climb if mine did. The man came out the wrong door, which is to say, the one we had hoped he'd prefer when the sun tipped. He reached for his phone and found silence. He hesitated half a beat. The beat we had budgeted in pencil. That was enough. Hands behind head, plastic cuffs. No hero music, just the soft click of something finished. Back in the room that leaned, sweat made maps of everyone's shirts. The youngest operator laughed like relief had surprised him. The chief stared at the board I'd marked up and ran his finger along a web I'd drawn, arcs around a corner, times tied to habits, soft fails, circled where we could see them. "You spin." That he asked finally, like a man reluctant to admit a marvel he respects. "I draw maps," I said. "And listen." He grunted. "Widow spun it," the kid blurted, pointing to the fat red hourglass someone had sketched by the radio when I wasn't looking. The room laughed the way men laugh when they want to keep a thing. The name stuck. Not because it sounded fierce, but because it named a craft laying silk where a foot might fall. I didn't use it. Call signs are for other people's mouths. For me, work had nouns you could inventory: batteries, fuel, routes, windows. But nicknames travel faster than memos. On a range outside an island that had run out of patience, a visiting commander squinted at a checklist I'd bled of poetry and said, half smiling, "So you're the one who hears the web hum." I wanted to roll my eyes and didn't. "I hear men," I said. "The web is what they move through." Not every night cooperated. A tire gave up on gravel we had scouted twice. A lamp died in the worst corner of a room that hated corners. Someone's breath stuttered 1 octave higher, and I knew which plan to abandon without making fear a general. Hold 2. Window not door. 4. Pivot now. Later alone, my hands shook hard enough that I sat on them, an old trick from Annapolis, when pride had to wait its turn. Everyone came back with all their fingers. The chief called that proof. She hears the hum, he told a newcomer, who still called me ma'am like a prayer. Pay attention when she goes quiet. Between forward and home, there's Coronado. Again the wind getting its steps. In sand finding new ways to disagree. In those intervals, I rewrote checklists until they matched the shape of actual days. Equipment that lies about battery life. Lines that fail when rain decides to rehearse. Pages for after the after when adrenaline leaves and the room gets too large. Old guard grumbled until the metrics shut them up fewer, near misses fewer nights when luck pretended to be planning. I mailed reports. I did not mail stories. At home, my father kept the porch tight as inspection and the silence tighter. Mom's letters arrived in a different handwriting, now mine copied from her habit of mercy. I asked teams how their air was on the inside and pretended it was a logistical inquiry. We knocked twice on the table before briefs without knowing when we started. Men who didn't write cards left one on my desk at Christmas with a sentence that could carry a winter. Your web kept me breathing this year. I filed it under reasons. There were costs. A good man went quiet one spring and didn't find his sound again. I learned the difference between breaking and bending and wrote it into the margins of every plan. Respect is a logistics problem. If you plan for dignity, fewer things break that you can't fix. Word traveled the way stories do when they belong to rooms that don't take pictures. A visiting captain shook my hand like he was confirming a rumor he wanted to side with. Younger operators watched the board while pretending to study their boots. My posture changed in rooms I didn't own. Not taller, steadier. There's a kind of authority that doesn't raise its voice because it knows where the exits are. The night before the hearing that would bring the Admiral and stall a judge's hand, a kid I'd watched improve his jaw, less clench. More aim asked a question he thought was about maps. How do you know which door, he said. I answered. I know which door we can afford to be wrong about. He nodded like a man discovering there are kinds of courage that don't involve volume. Call, sign Iron Widow. The words would walk into rooms ahead of me. My father would hear them like a language he'd never learned and pretend grammar could save him. The truth is simpler. I stood where plans live and credit doesn't. I spun silk where men had to step and taught myself not to need applause to keep weaving. On good nights, the web held. On bad ones, it kept the fall shorter. Either way, the hum, quiet and insistent, told me I was doing the job I had chosen, not the one anyone else had assigned. Letters came back like boomerangs no one threw. The first one wore a yellow sticker, undeliverable, forwarding, expired. I checked the address twice then. A third time, the way you do when the truth is rude. The second came back cleaner, as if the post office had learned my intent and wanted to leave fewer fingerprints. After that, I stopped using stamps and switched to the kind of updates that live in a mother's phone. I'm eating. I'm sleeping. I'm fine. Fine is a dialect we both spoke when the weather inside us wasn't ready for a forecast. I wrote him anyway because discipline taught me to log what mattered. A brief about a training module that finally matched the shape of the days we actually lived. A note about a young operator who had learned to breathe before talking. A photograph, once me at the pier with a pelican case salt, turning the chain link fence into lace. I tucked it next to a sentence I thought he could respect. You taught me to stand straight. It helps. A month later, the same photo came back in a fresh envelope creased once across the middle with no note. Even an eraser leaves crumbs. Silence, when it's careful, doesn't. Mom filled the distance like someone who knows where the bridges go. Sunday evenings. If the time zones behaved, she called and asked small questions that let large answers through. Anything green on your plate? Are you sleeping on cotton or sand? Find a chapel yet? She never asked for stories. She asked for breath. When the call dropped, I stood in the corridor and cataloged the air. I learned to tell the difference between stale and spent. Illness entered our lives with the librarian's voice of a nurse. Biopsy. She said to my mother like she was sounding out a spelling bee word over the phone. Dad emailed a subject line with the word update, 2 sentences, both correctly punctuated. He did not ask me to come. I was already moving work, pulling me like a tide logistics, a liturgy my body had learned by rote. Mom said not yet, in a tone that had comforted fevers and freshmen alike. Do your job, I'll do mine. I flew home when hospice entered the conversation like a chaplain, quiet, unavoidable, refusing euphemism. The air in the room was blue, not color feeling. The machines wore their own kind of courtesy. Mom's hands had gone to parchment. Dad's had become a scaffold around a coffee cup. He stood at the window guarding the parking lot like it might take a hill if he looked away. Coffee, he asked, because rituals were the last uniform he trusted. I read to her instead because words were the first house we built together. Frost, then Mary Oliver, then whatever the visitor library offered with a spine that hadn't given up yet. When she woke clear, she pressed 2 fingers to my sleeve and said what I didn't know I'd been training to hear. Keep flying, not away, just up. She died before sunrise, and the room changed key. Grief has its own physics. It makes the floor tilt, and the air thick, and the clock arrogant. At the funeral, he spoke first geometry of a life measured by schedules kept and corners squared. I spoke second lemons in winter, in the car pencil shavings in a glass ashtray, the way she could name birds by silhouette. He stapled the program over and over like paper could become armor if you layered it enough. We stood near the same casket like strangers convened by weather. Back on base, I added a box to every plan. Who calls home if it goes sideways? We wrote names and numbers with ink that wouldn't surrender to sweat. Respect is a logistics problem. So is mercy. Plan for both and fewer things. Break that you can't fix. The old guard teased until the first time the box did its quiet job, and a voice that would have found a wall found a human instead. We started asking each other, "How's your air?" And we meant inside, not outside. Some men looked startled the first time, like we'd opened a door they didn't know existed. Then they answered, not with speeches, but with weather reports' clear gusting fog. The letter I never got from him became a story I stopped telling myself at night. You can wait forever for a verdict from a judge who doesn't know he's presiding. I learned to carry without permission. I learned that silence can punish, yes, but it can also be the place you discover how to breathe under your own orders. At Christmas time, a card appeared on my desk block capitals and a sentence that practiced understatement like a craft. Your web kept me breathing this year. I filed it where I kept reasons. We lost a diver to an ocean that had run out of patience. We stood on a parade deck in dress blues while the wind stitched its own harsh hymn through the ranks. A bell counted too small for the size of the absence. A kid who'd been turning into a man asked afterward how to bear it. You don't, I said. You carry it. There's a difference. I wrote that into the protocol we started calling. After the after-quiet pages that told a mind what to do when adrenaline had left and silence arrived with luggage. It was not therapy. It was survival with the decency of a checklist. I kept writing him. Not the him who folded towels with corners that met like promises. The him who might someday be willing to audit his own map. A clipping about a new training approach that trimmed near misses by half. A note that said, the coffee here is unforgivable, but the chaplain knows when to sit and shut up. I stamped them and sent them and did not look for boomerangs. When his birthday came, I mailed a book of national parks because once when I was 7, he lifted me up to a wooden bear carved outside a gift shop and said, that's the real country. Inside, I wrote, we could go see one together. He sent a thank you card with his name typed under the closing, like he were signing orders no one would argue. It was progress if you squinted and called tired steps a march. The Admiral visited our board once and ran a finger down a column I'd labeled soft fail, places a plan could bow without breaking. You're building humility into the wall, he said. Not unkindly. Walls save lives, I answered, but doors save more. He nodded and asked me to brief a room that had confused rank with proof. I brought one slide. Respect is a logistics problem. They laughed, then wrote it down when we walked through how it changes batteries purchased and hours slept and marriages that make it to shore. I tried calling him from a stairwell in Bahrain where the heat stuck like a wet shirt. He answered on the second ring, said hello, like a password. We discussed gutters and weather and the neighbor's maple that had leaned dangerous for years, and finally took the fence. He said, "Check your tires before winter." We hung up like we had coordinated a delivery I would never sign for. But the next day, the silence didn't bite. It sat like furniture you stop tripping over when you learn the floor plan. If I speak of him, hard know that I learned the shape of my own mercy with the same hands he taught to grip a wrench. He gave me discipline as a first language. It made my back straight and my plans tighter than fear. He gave me silence as a second language. It taught me to let rooms find their own gravity and to listen for the hum beneath the noise. Mom gave me the rest, the grammar of kindness. Between the three, I could write orders to myself that didn't lie. The day a mutual friend from their church wrote in looping, cursive. He keeps your picture in his study. He doesn't talk about it. I put the letter on the wall with blue painter's tape and let it adjust the room. Care can look like custody. Pride can look like neglect. Weather looks like weather until it changes your route. I circled a date on my calendar I hadn't named yet and called it church because that route leaves room for delays like grace. Before the hearing that would stall a judge's hand and lift a town to its feet, before the Admiral spoke my call sign like a flag unfolded in air that had earned it. The only commendation I claimed came from quiet outcomes. Men walking back into fluorescent light with all their fingers, a kid knocking on a door jamb twice. Before briefs a chief who stopped calling what I did soft because it kept him from burying one of his own. Revenge didn't feel like spectacle. It felt like standing so straight other people remembered their spines and found them sufficient. And if somewhere in a house, 2 states away, a man looked at a picture and didn't put it back in the drawer that was a kind of letter after all. The mission wore a simple name because complicated names tempt fate. We called it Harbor Choir. A narrow channel, a merchant hull flagged in a way that made honest men squint a rumor of men in the hold who wouldn't survive another tide. The charts said busy water. The radios said don't spook the dogs. The weather said you'll get one clean window and then the wind will go out of its way to disagree. I built the plan out of parts that didn't look like heroics fuel math tug schedules, the quiet choreography of boats that pretend not to notice each other. We studied the harbor the way a carpenter studies a beam for grain, for stress, for the knots that will split under the wrong nail. The target moved every morning like a man who values habit, but is ashamed to say so. At 04:30, he took coffee at a stand that called itself a cafe, and sold forgiveness to men who couldn't afford sleep. At 05:15, the harbor pilot hustled from ship to ship like a conductor, pretending the orchestra would listen without him. At 600, a tug shoved a freighter into alignment the way brothers do when fathers are watching. Our map named the lanes not with numbers, but with the language of choir practice soprano fast and bright under the lights. Alto steady wide, forgiving. Bass slow, low all bulk, short on grace. Harbor enforcement called them something else. We used our names because when the tide turns ugly, you want words that land in the mouth without hunting for consonants. We were not tasked to kick doors. We were tasked to set a stage so men could leave a room they hadn't chosen to enter. The intelligence was stubborn, a hold converted into a barracks without a chaplain. Air poor, water rationed like praise, weapons modest, but sufficient to ruin an hour you loved. The local commander wanted it quiet. So did I. Quiet work travels farther. At 0200, I ran a hand over the laminated board and felt the web hum, a good sign, a readiness. Soft fails, I told the team, tapping the corners. If the tug is late, we slide to alto. If the pilot calls weather, we hold it choir 2. If the target cuts 30 minutes early, we let him. Do not outrun his fear. The kid we'd been teaching to aim his jaw at problems instead of clenching at them nodded like he was filing a truth he'd needed. We moved before the town stirred. Harbor lights hung like tired moons over water that had learned to mind its own business. The smell was diesel and brine and old rope. Radios murmured, and I listened, not just for words, but for weather in voices. The half note that tells you someone's feet have remembered what sand does to courage. We placed a small craft where bass meets alto, the way you stand near a door you might need without telegraphing panic. Another sat humble at soprano 3 pretending to care about gulls. A third loitered like a bad idea made useful. On the pier, 2 men leaned in a posture that says, "Bored to anyone who doesn't know, boredom keeps you alive." The target hull slid where the math said it would. The gangway tilted like a sentence broken in the wrong place. A man with a clipboard hesitated, always a gift. He made a call and frowned at a screen that didn't answer, because 6 blocks away, for reasons the city would never discuss, a tower had gone to sleep. He tried again. Habit is a mercy and a trap. "Choir now," I said. The word traveled through headsets and shoulders. The first team boarded with the shabbiness of workers late to a job they didn't care about. A voice on the radio went half a tone high, then corrected itself. In the hold, air stank of iron and resignation. Men blinked like night had reconsidered its rules. We had rehearsed not just the angle of approach, but the order of sentences. Language can blow a door off its hinges if you don't mind it. "We're leaving the point, man," said in a voice that sounded like Tuesday. "Stay with me." A second voice whispered a prayer in a dialect I didn't share, but the cadence was familiar promise: step, breathe. Up top, a guard, who had never been paid enough, raised a rifle and lowered it in the same motion. He had seen a plan before and recognized one now. "Window," I said, because one had opened that wasn't scheduled. The men used it without congratulating themselves. On the pier, enforcement pretended to be interested in paperwork with a vigor that fooled no one and saved lives anyway. A forklift developed a flat nobody regretted. A harbor master discovered standards in a drawer he'd forgotten. A siren in a distant street gave a small rehearsal and then remembered it wasn't called today. "Alto," I said. The route that left room for mercy. The boats moved with a slowness that read as confidence. The water muttered. The wind cleared its throat and decided to wait. In the hold, a hand clutched a sleeve that clutched back. At the edge of the channel, a child saw men who looked like statues in a book step into daylight and decided the world might be bigger. A radio coughed. The voice behind it belonged to the chief whose face time and weather had carved into something honest. "Package is breathing," he said. He doesn't say safe until safe arrives and sits down. "Church?" he asked. He was teasing because he could. "Church," I answered. "Leave room for grace." Laughter clicked across the net like a lighter that catches without shame. We were almost past the worst corner when the pump in Boat 2 hiccuped with the stubborn timing of machinery that hates metaphor. I had heard that sound in different rooms and knew what it meant here. "Switch pairs," I said. "Don't chase speed." A young operator's breath stuttered, and then matched the rhythm we taught in on 4 out on 6, "Let the numbers count you home." On the pier, a man in a cheap jacket began to notice a pattern. Patterns scare men who traffic in chaos. He moved toward a radio and found it sleeping in the same tower his friend had tried. He shouted, and the shout died near his shoes. Somewhere in the city, a cat knocked a can off a ledge, and the noise meant more. We reached the mouth of the channel just as the wind remembered its grievance. Whitecaps raised their narrow shoulders. The boats rode them like men who have made a friend of physics. I watched profiles on my board and listened to voices turn from razor to rope. "Copy," the chief said. "Copy," the kid echoed the word, finding muscle. At the safe key, we did not cheer. We did not clap. Men counted heads and fingers. Someone exhaled like an oath had been kept. A narrow man with eyes that had learned to catalog damage touched the rail and wept without making a noise about it. The point man said the same sentence he'd said in the dark. "We're leaving. Stay with me." It seemed less like an order now and more like a promise the world could use. The after action was a room with bad coffee and chairs that lied about comfort. I wrote what happened and did not allocate heroics where systems had done their job. The chief drew a spider in the corner of my map, crude legs, and a red hourglass that bled through the page. "Widow spun it," he told the kid who grinned like the nickname had chosen the right house. The report continued, where rooms I don't brief read them. The Admiral's signature appeared later, a neat weight at the bottom of the page where men with stars agree that quiet work has consequences they approve. He called once after to ask about soft fail columns and why I name roots in ways that make men memorize without trying. Because fear hates poetry and remembers hymns, I said. He was quiet a second longer than custom. Brief me sometime, he said. Bring the board. Don't bring the slides. News does what it does in small towns when the world tilts somewhere else. Headlines in papers no one buys said a thing happened in a harbor whose name many mispronounced. Photographs showed nothing and protected everything. People in my father's diner talked about prices and weather and a high school team that might go far if knees held. A rumor passed through like a shy animal somebody's daughter had something to do with the thing that didn't go wrong. He didn't chase it. He held the paper the way you hold a letter that might explode if you open it. We rolled to the next training cycle because good outcomes breed amnesia if you let them. Men knocked twice on the table without irony. The kid's jaw aimed true more often than not. The chief stopped tapping his pen in briefs and listened like he might learn something even now. I added a box to the board I hadn't known I'd need. Who do we become if this works? Plans change people same as storms. When the summons came for a hearing far from harbors, I packed the board out of habit. The Admiral didn't need it. He carried the part of the plan that matters, the memory of men walking into light none of them expected to see. He said my call sign to a judge who didn't know he knew me. In a room stood the way water stands when wind stops arguing. In a pew, my father's hands seemed unsure about being hands. Pride rearranged itself into something humbler that could stand closer to truth without flinching. Harbor Choir read like a small chapter in a book that prefers margins. It had no movie scene and no parade route, but the men back at the key kept their fingers, and a narrow-eyed soul kept his future, and the web held under a weight it had budgeted for. That is how legends are born in rooms that don't say legend. Someone whispers a name because saying thank you out loud would admit a debt they don't know how to pay. The name travels. It arrives where it needs to. Sometimes it arrives in a courthouse where wood gleams like Sunday and a gavel hangs undecided in a judge's hand. The gavel never lands. It hovers like a hawk that can smell mice and mercy at once. The judge is an old friend of the town, the kind who once stood with me in an empty church lot and said, "Turn the wheel into it, not away." He sees the Admiral's stars, then the name on the docket, then me. For a heartbeat, he forgets which role to play. Call sign. Iron Widow the Admiral says again, not for effect, but to place the truth in the center of the room. His voice carries without volume. The bench behind him rises like wheat remembering wind. There is no order to stand. Some bodies know when honor enters the way, knees know how to unlock for prayer. My father does not rise. He stands already in the posture he trusts to do all his sentences for him. Hands clasped behind his back jaw, set to the angle that once told recruits storms will not be negotiated. He watches the standing with a suspicion he reserves for new tools. If it works, why didn't the old one? The clerk reads words that have more consonants than a man should be asked to carry. Allegation, docket, review. The Admiral requests closure on 31, citing my role with a neat list of exactness. Soft fails planned, seconds purchased, lives preserved. He offers none of the stories men tell later when fear needs a shape. He gives the judge the precise weight of the thing and no ribbon. The judge clears his throat. "Officer, do you wish to address the court?" The microphone waits expectant as an altar. "No, Your Honor." The Admiral answers for me. The work speaks. He turns his head enough that I catch the smallest shake. Not today. Let the silence do its job. The room continues to stand because sometimes sitting would be a kind of disrespect. A boy at the back whispers, "She's real," the way kids whisper when myths walk out of books and ask for coffee. A Vietnam vet in a jacket that still fits lays his hand over his heart because his muscles remember what the mind has the luxury to forget. The 7th grade civics teacher nods once like a sentence she taught came back to visit. My father tries humor an old screwdriver that has stripped more screws than he will admit. Well, he says to the room, palms half out, "I'm sure she's very good at spreadsheets." It's meant to invite nervous laughter into a space that has stopped hosting it. The room does not comply. Even jokes obey chain of command. The judge lets quiet say the first paragraph. Then, motion granted. Docket 31 is closed with commendation. He looks at me like a man who has just found a road that always existed and wants to apologize for the map. Let the record reflect, he adds, which is courtroom for hold, still while we draw the line straight. The Admiral thanks the bench with the tidy economy of a man whose gratitude isn't performative. He does not speak of legends. He does not say my name like a flag. That is for other rooms. He steps back, and the space he leaves behind is occupied by respect, the kind that shows up like a steady friend rather than a parade. A woman near the aisle starts to clap and stops herself. She folds her hands like she has remembered where she is. The sound that replaces applause is heavier shoes, settling breath, releasing the soft creak of wood meeting weight. Standing is the music here. My father finally turns to face me. His eyes perform inventory first, because that is what they were trained to do: braid ribbon bars, boots. Then he arrives at the thing he can't list, presence, and he does not know where to file it. He has spent a life translating the world into weight-bearing structures. This is a beam he cannot measure. Behind him, a cousin with my mother's eyebrows says quietly, "Uncle, maybe you don't know everything she is." The sentence lands like a hand put gently on the shoulder of a man who has been shouldering alone. The judge who used to talk carburetors with my father after church looks uncertain where to rest his eyes. He lands on me. "Is there anything you wish in the record, Lieutenant?" he asks, giving me one clean field of choice. I rise, because standing is sometimes the way you stop a room from tipping. Respect isn't inherited. I say, voice kept level, so no one else has to adjust theirs. It's earned. Some nights where no one can see. Some mornings in rooms like this. I don't look at my father when I say it. I let the room decide where to set the sentence down. The Admiral's mouth makes the smallest, almost smile approval without credit taking. The bailiff, who has seen more shouting in this room than I plan to give him, shifts his weight to the kind of at ease that isn't written in any manual. My father swallows. He is a man who knows how to chew and does not always know how to digest. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asks, not to the court, not to the Admiral, not to the town. To me, it is dangerously close to a real question. "Because you never asked," I say. Not cruel, not kind. Factual, like a weather report that explains flooded basements without apologizing for rain. He flinches as if grammar can bruise. The judge pretends to study a file. The Admiral pretends to study the flag. The room has the decency to find something else to look at. Shame is a private language. Translation is unkind. A young operator I know, by the shape of his shoulders, jaw, no longer clenched but aimed, speaks from the back without asking permission, because the right words sometimes skip the line. "Ma'am," he says clear. "We got home because she heard it before we did." He doesn't say web. He doesn't say hum. He says it like gravity. You can argue with poetry. You waste time arguing with physics. The VFW jacket nods and stands a little taller. The boy who whispered earlier pulls his shoulders back as if someone adjusted his uniform. The civics teacher writes a note in the air with an invisible pen. A harbor master who came for the paperwork and stayed for redemption wipes his eyes like he has discovered a draft. My father tries again, reaching for the tool he trusts most. I know the difference between a story and a life. He says, challenging the room to prove him wrong. The room declines. It has already chosen. "I'm not selling you a legend," I say more to the wood than to him. "I'm standing where you can see me. You don't argue with a chair about whether it holds. You sit or you don't." Mrs. Dwyer, who bandaged knees at the elementary school for 20 years and knows when to intervene, lifts the microphone, lowers it, and lets the room keep its own gravity. She is good at triage. The judge raps the gavel once, not to end, but to acknowledge the moment has stepped from air into record. "This hearing is adjourned," he says, voice softening. Nobody moves for half a beat longer than custom. Then movement returns like tide after wind. People drift to the aisle with faces that look freshly measured. The Admiral turns to me last and gives a salute that is almost private. I return it like men return borrowed tools, cleaned, oiled, as if it always belonged to them. He steps aside and lets me choose the door. Leadership looks like that more often than we admit. At the threshold, my father's mouth closes. The language he needs has missing planks. He manages my given name without rank. It lands between us like a coin on a counter. I nod the smallest permission. We can make change later. On the steps outside, the flag remembers wind and shows off a little. The courthouse bricks hold heat, like truth holds time. People say things that matter in voices built for recipes, and whether proud of you, didn't know, should have. I don't collect them. I let them pass through like good air. My father doesn't come down the steps right away. He stands under the lintel like a man negotiating a new map. The cousin with my mother's eyebrows touches his sleeve and releases it. He descends slowly as if the stairs require a different muscle than the one he has been exercising. He stops one step above me, so we are almost level. If any of this is true, he says each word weighed, I should have stood sooner. You still can, I answer. It isn't pardon. It isn't sentence. It is a route. He looks at the flag, then at the door he just used, then at me. A man planning an unfamiliar trip. The Admiral pretends to check a message and gives us the privacy of attention placed elsewhere. The judge steps into a circle of old men who will ask him what it felt like to change a record and will not ask what it felt like to be changed by one. The boy tugs a parent's sleeve and points not at me, at his own shoulders. That is the right direction for pointing. No music swells. The street carries the ordinary traffic of a Tuesday. Somewhere, a bell marks an hour without knowing which one it fixed. In the space between rooms, a town edits itself. In the space between sentences, a father considers a language he never wanted to learn and finally admits it might help him cross. Morning makes honest work of what night rehearses. The courthouse steps had worn yesterday's heat like a memory. My father's porch wears dew like a second thought. Paint flakes at the rail where hands have learned to land. The screen door complains the way old things do when change arrives. He opens it with his mouth already forming a sentence he doesn't yet know how to finish. Coffee, he asks, defaulting to ritual. He turns before I can answer because he knows how I take it and he needs a task to keep his hands from becoming symbols. The kitchen is the same room that taught my spine to act like a rule, same clock, new silence. He sets the mug on the table, sits across from me, and keeps both hands around his cup like warming them might make language more fluid. I didn't know the language there, he says. Finally, the way men confess when they're trying to inventory a tool they never bought. He doesn't have to point. There is only one there in the room. I spoke it like a tourist, loud and wrong. I didn't tell you, I answer. And you didn't ask? We nod, which is different from agreeing. The refrigerator hums the same long note it did when I wrote my application essay on this table. Time hasn't changed its key. People have. He looks toward the hallway, where metals sleep behind glass and blink in filtered light. I built a house out of order, he says, staring past the doorway at something heavy. I thought it could carry everything. His eyes return to me. Some weights weren't designed for it. He isn't apologizing. He's showing the math he used, the math that kept our roof tight and made our dinners on time and left me standing outside his map. Walls save lives, I say. Doors save more. He nods because he taught me the first part. He is learning the second. We talk not about harbor choir or checklists or how a man with a rough beard breathed easier because a tower slept exactly when we needed it to. We talk about thinner, ordinary things that can carry heavier truths. How grief moved in and rearranged furniture. How mom used pencil because mercy erases cleaner. How silence can be a punishment or a porch light depending on who stands under it. I thought a man proves love by building, he says, looking down into coffee that has stopped steaming. Houses, schedules, spines. He glances up. I didn't know you were building too. Different kind. Quieter. A laugh escapes him without permission. Short and embarrassed. Spreadsheets, he murmurs, self-indictment dressed as humor. Plans I correct gently. Maps. Soft fails where we can see them. He taps the table twice, an old habit pretending to be new. That boy at the hearing, he said you heard it before they did. He studies me like I might give him a schematic. What did you hear? Men, I say, not legends. The way a voice goes, half a tone high before a bad angle. The way silence changes shape when fear sits down. The way hope makes a room taller by 1 inch at a time. I think of the kid who used to aim his jaw at the floor and now aims it at the horizon. The hum I add, and he flinches at the word like it's poetry he's not sure he's entitled to enjoy. I wanted a son, he says plain as a ledger. Then after a beat, the education arriving in its own time, I needed a daughter. He waits as if the room might reject the sentence. It doesn't. The clock says yes in the only tongue it knows. We go outside because hard conversations breathe better on porches. The flag at the eave lifts and settles like a chest, learning a new pace. He points at the maple across the street, whose roots buckled the sidewalk back when I thought sidewalks were laws and trees were excuses. Storm took that limb last spring, he says. Missed the neighbor's car by a foot. He squints not at the tree at his own memory. I told myself I'd trimmed it. I hadn't. I just hoped. He lets out a breath shaped like a lesson. Hope's not a plan. No, I say because he likes hearing truth hold. But it's better than pride. Pride eats the plan if you don't watch it. He smiles without enjoying it. Dad's pride. Shattered, he quotes voice. Careful around the words other people use when they tell our story. That's the headline, right? He shakes his head. Sounds violent. It wasn't. It was geometry. I'd drawn the wrong angle for too long. He opens his hands in his lap. You redrew it by standing where I could see. We sit quiet while a neighbor waters tomatoes like he's paying installments on something holy. A jogger passes and salutes the flag with 2 fingers, a small debt paid in motion. Ordinary is doing its appointed duty. I kept your picture, he says, almost offhand, like a man leaving a tip. In my study. Thought if I didn't say it, I couldn't be accused of needing it. He looks at me, then owning the admission. I needed it. The porch knows when to creak. It creaks. I brought you a book once, I say. Parks. We could still go? He inhales like a man learning the weight of consent. You choose the route, he says. Tell me where to put my hands. It is both a joke and a request. I give him the mercy of treating it like the cleaner one. We'll take church, I say. Leave room for delays like grace. The day moves. We talk gutters. Tires the neighbor's cat whose arrogance has tenure. We talk about mom without turning her into a monument. We talk like people who intend to talk again. When I stand to go, he stands too. Old men in town taught him that courtesy, and it has never stopped being useful. On the step, he pauses. Proud, he says one word, stripped of parade, naked enough to startle truth. Then softer, even when I didn't know how. The apology is not the word, it is the posture. He is not performing, he is standing where he can see me. Back on base, I brief a room that thinks human factors are optional and logistics is just inventory. I bring 1 slide. Respect is a logistics problem. Then I tell them about batteries that lie and marriages that survive because someone wrote a checklist called After the After and asked, how's your air without making a man feel smaller for having lungs? I tell them doors save more than walls do. They laugh in the right place, then write in the right place. That is what learning sounds like when lives are in the balance. Letters arrive in blocks and hands. A young officer writes, my room resents my pronouns. Advice I answer. Show your math, share your credit, knock twice before you enter any soul. She tapes it inside a locker next to her mother holding a wrench. An old chief who once called my pages soft sends a photograph of his grandchild sleeping on his chest. He writes, your web gave me another Christmas. The card doesn't go on a wall. It goes in the desk drawer where my hands can find it when the hum is faint. At dusk, I drive to the river. The water wears the moon like a bruise softening. I think of harbor choir and the hold that smelled like iron and resignation of the kid's breath, finding the rhythm in on 4 out on 6 of the way a town stood without orders because honor entered by a door no one had opened for it. Revenge, the kind that sells tickets, spikes and burns out. This felt like something quieter and edit. A room correcting itself. A father shifting his weight from pride to respect without breaking a hip. A community learning that women's work sometimes looks exactly like service because it is. I park in front of the house where paint needs a second coat and a porch has learned patience. He steps out carrying 2 mugs, one in each hand, as if balance can be practiced into forgiveness. We sit. He doesn't ask about harbors. I don't offer. We watch the flag, remember the wind, and act like a team. If this sat with you, if it reminded you of a room that changed because someone finally told the truth, or of a person who stood for you when others didn't take a breath with me, tell someone your moment so they can borrow your courage. And if you want more stories that carry weight without shouting about service mercy and standing tall, stick around, share this with a friend who needs it and subscribe so we can rise straighter together.